There's a peculiar darkness that arrives uninvited, settling into the corners of our consciousness when we realize we've walked too far down a path we should have questioned from the beginning. It's not the darkness of night, easily dispelled by morning light, but rather the kind that lingers in the hollow spaces between what we knew and what we refused to see. This is the territory where Ibn Arabi's words echo with a weight that feels almost prophetic, almost cruel in their simplicity. Learn before life forces you to learn the hard way. 5 words that contain within them the entire architecture of human suffering and wisdom. We exist in a strange paradox, don't we? We are creatures capable of extraordinary foresight, able to build civilizations and predict eclipses. Yet we stumble blindly into the same emotional pits that have claimed countless others before us. There's something almost beautiful in this tragedy, this insistence on touching the flame ourselves, despite every warning, every scar visible on those who came before. The mind understands, but the heart demands its own proof. And so we learn, not through the gentle instruction of words and wisdom, but through the visceral education of consequence. Consider for a moment the architecture of regret. It builds itself slowly, brick by brick, in decisions we make when we know better but choose otherwise. Each choice that contradicts our deeper knowing adds another layer to this structure until one day we find ourselves trapped inside it, wondering how we arrived at this particular prison. The walls are made of should-haves and could-haves, mortared together with the bitter cement of hindsight. And here's the cruelest part. We always knew. Somewhere in the depths of our being, beneath the noise of desire and fear and pride, we always knew. The human mind possesses an extraordinary capacity for self-deception. We are masters at constructing elaborate narratives that justify what we want to believe rather than what we need to understand. This talent, this gift for mental gymnastics, serves us in the moment, but betrays us in the long run. We tell ourselves stories about why this relationship is different, why this decision will work out, why the rules that apply to everyone else somehow don't apply to us. And perhaps this is necessary, this temporary blindness, because to see everything clearly all the time would be to live in a state of paralysis, unable to move forward for fear of every possible consequence. But there's a difference between healthy optimism and willful ignorance, between taking calculated risks and deliberately ignoring the calculations altogether. Ibn Arabi understood this distinction with the clarity that comes from observing not just the surface of human behavior, but its depths. He recognized that life itself is a teacher, but a harsh one, unforgiving in its curriculum. The lessons are always there, written in the experiences of others, encoded in ancient wisdom, whispered by our own intuition. Yet we so often choose to ignore them, believing somehow that our story will be different, that the laws of cause and effect will make an exception for us. Think about the person who watches their parents struggle in a toxic marriage, yet repeats the exact same patterns in their own relationships. Or the individual who witnesses a friend destroy themselves with addiction, yet experiments with the same substances, convinced they'll maintain control. We see these patterns everywhere, this compulsive repetition of suffering, and we wonder, why? Why do we insist on learning everything the hard way? The answer lies in the gap between intellectual understanding and embodied wisdom. We can know something with our minds without truly understanding it in our bones, in our blood. In the deep places where real transformation occurs, the hard way is expensive. It costs us time we can never recover, relationships we can never repair, versions of ourselves we can never return to. It extracts payment in the currency of pain, regret, and lost opportunity. And yet, for many of us, it remains the only teacher we truly trust. There's something in the human psyche that demands direct experience, that refuses to accept second-hand knowledge as legitimate. We need to feel the burn to believe in fire. We need to experience the fall to respect the height. This isn't weakness. It's a fundamental aspect of how we're wired, this need for experiential confirmation. But here's what Ibn Arabi invites us to consider. What if there's another way? What if we could develop the capacity to learn from observation, from contemplation, from the accumulated wisdom of those who walked before us? What if we could treat life not as an adversary that must beat lessons into us, but as a collaborative teacher, one we choose to listen to before the volume gets turned up to unbearable levels? This isn't about avoiding all mistakes or living a life of perfect caution. It's about discernment, about developing the ability to distinguish between necessary risks and unnecessary suffering. The process of learning before the hard lessons arrive requires a particular kind of humility, one that runs counter to almost everything our culture tells us. We live in a world that celebrates confidence, certainty, the bold declaration that we know what we're doing. But true wisdom often begins with the admission that we don't know, that we could be wrong, that perhaps the people warning us about the cliff ahead might actually see something we're missing. This humility isn't weakness, it's the foundation of genuine intelligence. It's the ability to say, I don't need to verify every danger personally. I can learn from the experiences of others. Consider the nature of warning signs. Life doesn't usually ambush us with disaster, without first sending messengers, little hints and whispers that something isn't quite right. The relationship that feels subtly off from the beginning, the business opportunity that seems too good to be true, the friendship that requires you to constantly compromise your values. These signs are there, but we've become skilled at dismissing them, at finding reasons to ignore what our intuition is trying to tell us. We want what we want, and our ability to rationalize is nearly infinite, so we push forward, and the warning signs escalate, becoming harder to ignore, until finally they transform into consequences we can no longer deny. There's a particular kind of pain that comes from preventable suffering, from looking back and seeing clearly all the moments where we could have chosen differently. It's different from the pain that comes from unavoidable tragedy or random misfortune. This is the pain of recognition, the sharp sting of knowing we authored our own downfall page by page, choice by choice. And perhaps this is the hardest lesson of all, that we are far more responsible for our circumstances than we'd like to admit. External factors matter, certainly, but our response to them, our choices in the face of them, these shape our reality more than we often acknowledge. The question then becomes, how do we learn to learn differently? How do we develop the capacity to extract wisdom from sources other than personal catastrophe? It begins with attention, with cultivating the ability to actually see what's in front of us rather than what we want to see. This means getting honest about our patterns, about the stories we tell ourselves, about the ways we justify decisions we know in our gut are wrong. It means being willing to sit with discomfort rather than immediately seeking to resolve it through action. It means learning to distinguish between the voice of fear, which often tries to keep us small and safe, and the voice of wisdom, which sometimes warns us away from genuine danger. Observation becomes a practice, a discipline. We watch not just our own lives, but the lives around us, not with judgment, but with curiosity. What patterns repeat? What choices lead to what consequences? When people express regret, what common themes emerge? The answers are there, written in every memoir, every conversation, every story people tell when they're being honest about their mistakes. But we have to be willing to see ourselves in these stories, rather than immediately thinking of all the ways we're different. We have to be willing to accept that, yes, that could be me, that probably will be me if I continue down this path. There's also the practice of pausing, of creating space between impulse and action. So much of learning the hard way comes from our inability to delay gratification, to sit with uncertainty, to think beyond the immediate moment. We want what we want right now, and we're willing to pay almost any future price to have it. But what if we could develop the capacity to imagine our future selves, to feel genuine empathy for the person we'll be in 6 months or 6 years? What if we could make decisions not just based on what feels good in this moment, but on what we'll be grateful for having chosen later? The truth is that wisdom is always available. It exists in books that have been written, in conversations that could be had, in quiet moments of reflection we could choose. The universe isn't withholding knowledge from us. We're refusing to access it. We're choosing noise over silence, distraction over contemplation, momentum over reflection. And then we're shocked when we end up somewhere we never meant to go, having become someone we never meant to be. But the path was marked the entire time, the signs were there. We just weren't looking. This brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable truth. Some of us are addicted to drama, to chaos, to the intensity of learning the hard way. There's an adrenaline that comes with crisis, a clarity that emerges in catastrophe, a sense of being fully alive that we struggle to find in calmer waters. And so we unconsciously create situations that will force growth through suffering because we don't trust that growth can happen any other way. We sabotage the good relationships, make the reckless choices, push until something breaks, because breaking and rebuilding feels more real than maintaining and nurturing. This is worth examining honestly. Do we actually want to learn the easier way, or have we become attached to the drama of difficult lessons? Ibn Arabi's wisdom points toward something more than just practical advice about avoiding mistakes. It points toward a fundamental reorientation of how we approach existence itself. What if life isn't something to be conquered or survived, but rather something to be learned from continuously? What if every moment contains teachings, if only we develop the eyes to see them? This shifts us from a defensive posture, always bracing for the next blow, to a receptive one, always open to the next insight. It transforms us from victims of circumstance to students of experience. But let's be clear, this doesn't mean we'll avoid all pain. Some lessons can only be learned through direct experience. Some growth requires difficulty. The question is whether we can distinguish between necessary struggle and unnecessary suffering, between the challenges that forge us and the disasters we invite through negligence and pride. There's a difference between the difficulty of climbing a mountain and the pain of repeatedly falling off a cliff we were warned about. Both are hard, but one builds something, while the other merely breaks. The people who manage to learn before life forces them often share certain characteristics. They possess curiosity without arrogance, confidence without certainty, ambition without recklessness. They ask questions, they seek advice, and actually consider it, rather than just waiting for their turn to explain why their situation is different. They read, they reflect, they examine their own motivations with unflinching honesty. They understand that being wrong is not a personal failure, but an opportunity for correction. They can change their minds when presented with new information rather than doubling down to protect their ego. These people also tend to have what psychologists call emotional granularity, the ability to identify and articulate subtle emotional states. This matters because so much of learning the hard way comes from misreading our own internal signals. We confuse excitement with intuition, anxiety with anticipation, attraction with love, pride with confidence. When we can't accurately identify what we're feeling, we make decisions based on misinterpreted data. We think we're following our heart when we're actually being led by our wounds. We believe we're being brave when we're actually being reckless. Emotional intelligence becomes essential to learning without devastation. There's also the matter of time orientation. People who learn more easily tend to be capable of long-term thinking, of projecting themselves into the future and making decisions from that vantage point. They ask themselves, will I be glad I did this? What will this choice look like 5 years from now? Who am I becoming through these actions? This temporal perspective creates a different decision-making framework than simple present-moment desire. It doesn't eliminate mistakes, but it reduces the frequency of catastrophic ones, the kind that require years to recover from. Consider the relationship between learning and identity. So often, we resist learning until forced, because accepting a new truth means acknowledging we were wrong. And acknowledging we were wrong means revising our self-concept. If I've built an identity around being someone who trusts their instincts, then accepting that my instincts led me astray threatens my entire sense of self. If I've told myself I'm a good judge of character, then recognizing I've misjudged someone fundamentally challenges my self-image. So we hold on to failing strategies, toxic relationships, and flawed beliefs, because releasing them means releasing a piece of how we understand ourselves. The hard way forces this release by making the cost of holding on exceed the cost of letting go. But what if we could build identities flexible enough to accommodate error? What if instead of, I'm someone who always knows what's right, we told ourselves, I'm someone who's learning to know what's right? This subtle shift creates room for growth without crisis, for correction without catastrophe. It allows us to say, I was wrong about that, without it meaning, I am wrong as a person. This distinction matters more than we often realize. It's the difference between defensive rigidity and adaptive resilience. The hard way also teaches us about our capacity for endurance, which is perhaps its only real gift. When we survive what we didn't think we could survive, we discover resources within ourselves we didn't know existed. We learn we're stronger than we believed, more resilient than we imagined. But here's the question worth sitting with. Did we need that particular lesson? Was that specific suffering necessary to discover that strength? Or could we have developed resilience through challenges we chose consciously rather than disasters we stumbled into unconsciously? The answer varies, but it's worth examining honestly rather than automatically romanticizing every hardship as necessary. There's a seductive narrative in our culture around learning through suffering. The idea that only pain produces real growth, that ease makes us soft, and struggle makes us strong. This contains some truth, but also serves as justification for not learning any other way. It lets us off the hook for our poor choices by framing them as necessary education rather than avoidable mistakes. Yes, difficulty often produces growth, but unnecessary difficulty often produces only trauma and regret. We need to be able to tell the difference. Think about the concept of transferred wisdom, the ability to apply lessons from one domain to another. Someone who's burned their hand on a stove doesn't need to burn their foot to understand that hot things cause pain. They can transfer that knowledge. Yet emotionally and psychologically, we often fail to make these transfers. We repeat the same patterns in different contexts, convinced each time it will be different. The emotionally unavailable partner, who comes with a different face but the same fundamental incapacity. The job that promises fulfillment but delivers the same exhaustion as the last one. The friend who takes more than they give, just like the one before. Our inability to recognize patterns across contexts keeps us locked in cycles of repetitive learning. Breaking these cycles requires developing what we might call pattern recognition, the ability to see beneath surface differences to underlying structures. This is where observation of others becomes so valuable. When we hear someone describe their experience, instead of immediately thinking about how our situation is different, we ask, what's the common element here? What underlying dynamic am I seeing? Is there anything in my own life that shares this structure, even if the details differ? This kind of thinking allows wisdom to transfer, allows learning to accumulate, rather than needing to be earned separately in every single context. The role of community in learning cannot be overstated. When we isolate ourselves, we lose access to collective wisdom, to the experiences and insights of others who might see what we cannot. But seeking community requires humility, requires being willing to hear things we might not want to hear. It means surrounding ourselves with people who care enough to tell us hard truths rather than just affirming what we want to believe. These relationships are rare and precious because they require mutual commitment to growth over comfort, to honesty over harmony. They're also the relationships that often help us learn without catastrophe by offering perspective before we've gone too far down a dangerous path. There's something to be said, too, about the relationship between learning and presence. So much of the hard way comes from not being truly present to our lives, not paying attention to what's actually happening versus what we want to be happening. We miss the signs because we're not looking. We ignore the warnings because we're not listening. We're so focused on our narratives, our desires, our plans, that we fail to register the reality unfolding around us. Presence, true presence, creates the conditions for learning without disaster, by allowing us to course correct early, to notice when something's off before it becomes catastrophic. Meditation, contemplation, any practice that develops attention becomes practical rather than merely spiritual in this context. It's not about achieving some transcendent state. It's about developing the capacity to see clearly, to notice subtleties, to be awake to the present moment rather than lost in mental narratives. This attention allows us to catch mistakes earlier, to recognize patterns sooner, to intervene in our own trajectories before momentum carries us somewhere we don't want to go. It's preventive medicine for the soul. But let's acknowledge the genuine difficulty here. The easy way isn't actually easy. Learning from observation, from study, from reflection, requires consistent effort and discipline. It demands that we fight against our natural inclinations toward immediate gratification and experiential verification. It asks us to trust sources of knowledge beyond our direct experience, which goes against deep evolutionary programming. In some ways, learning the hard way is actually the path of least resistance in the moment, even though it's more costly in the long run. This is why it's so common. We're not stupid for choosing it, we're human. But being human also means we have the capacity to choose differently. The development of wisdom, then, becomes a conscious practice rather than an automatic result of aging. Age gives us time to accumulate experiences, but it doesn't automatically translate those experiences into wisdom. We all know people who've repeated the same year 50 times and called it a life, who at 70 are no wiser than they were at 20, just more tired and more cynical. The difference between those who age into wisdom and those who age into bitterness comes down to what they do with their experiences. Do they extract meaning? Do they allow themselves to be changed? Do they apply what they've learned? Or do they just accumulate injuries and grievances, using past pain as justification for present rigidity? Real learning requires vulnerability, the willingness to admit we don't know, to be changed by what we discover. This vulnerability becomes harder as we age because we've invested so much in our current understanding of things. We've built lives on certain assumptions, constructed identities around particular beliefs. To question them fundamentally threatens the entire structure we've created. So we defend, we justify, we explain away anything that doesn't fit our current paradigm. And in doing so, we close ourselves off from the very learning that might set us free from patterns that no longer serve us. Ibn Arabi's words carry particular weight because they come from the Sufi tradition, a path deeply concerned with the purification and development of the self. In this tradition, life is understood as a series of teachings designed to return us to our essential nature, to strip away the false layers we've accumulated, to reveal what was always true beneath the constructions of ego and culture. From this perspective, the hard way isn't just more painful, it's less efficient. It's taking the long, winding, treacherous path up the mountain when a clearer, more direct route exists. But we can't see that route because we're too busy insisting we already know the way. The spiritual dimension of learning adds another layer to this discussion. If we understand ourselves as more than just physical beings, if we accept that there's something in us that transcends the material, then learning becomes about alignment with something deeper than external success or pain avoidance. It becomes about the development of the soul, about becoming who we're meant to be rather than just avoiding who we fear becoming. From this view, the lessons are always gentle at first, arriving as whispers, as intuitions, as subtle feelings of misalignment. They only become harsh when we refuse to listen to the gentle teachings. This reframes suffering not as random or punitive, but as escalating communication from a reality trying to teach us something essential. The universe, life, God, whatever you want to call it, starts with a tap on the shoulder. Ignored long enough, that tap becomes a push. Ignored further, it becomes a shove. Eventually, if necessary, it becomes a brick wall we run into at full speed. But at every stage, we had the option to pay attention, to learn from the gentler teaching. The hard way is what happens when we exhaust all the softer options through our refusal to listen. This doesn't mean victim blaming or suggesting that all suffering is self-created. Random tragedy exists. Circumstances beyond our control exist. But within the realm of what we can influence, which is larger than we usually acknowledge, we often have more choice than we exercise. We can choose to pay attention or to ignore. We can choose to reflect or to react. We can choose to learn from others or to insist on personal verification of every truth. These choices compound over time, creating trajectories that lead either toward wisdom or toward unnecessary suffering. Consider the role of ego in all this. The ego loves to be right, to maintain its sense of superiority and specialness. It resists learning from others because accepting their wisdom means admitting they might know something it doesn't. The ego wants to discover everything itself, to be the hero of its own story, to earn wisdom through personal triumph over adversity. There's something inherently grandiose in insisting on learning everything the hard way, as if the rules that apply to everyone else somehow don't apply to us, as if we're special enough to succeed where countless others have failed using the same approach. This grandiosity keeps us locked in repetitive cycles of suffering that we could avoid through simple humility. But humility isn't about thinking less of ourselves. It's about thinking of ourselves less, about being willing to consider that we might not have all the answers, that we might be wrong, that someone else's experience might contain valuable information for our own journey. This kind of humility creates receptivity, makes us teachable, allows wisdom to enter through any door rather than only through the doorway of personal catastrophe. It's not weakness. It's the foundation of genuine strength because it allows us to adapt, to change, to grow, without first requiring complete destruction of our current state. The practice of learning before being forced involves cultivating certain qualities: patience with ourselves and the process, curiosity about what we don't know, honesty about what we do know but don't want to accept, courage to act on wisdom even when it's uncomfortable, and discernment to distinguish between useful caution and limiting fear. None of these qualities develop overnight. They require consistent practice, regular cultivation, a commitment to growth that extends beyond crisis moments into the mundane dailiness of existence. There's also something to be said about the role of rest and reflection in learning. We live in a culture that glorifies constant action, that treats contemplation as laziness, but wisdom requires space, requires time to integrate experiences, to draw connections, to allow patterns to emerge from the chaos of daily events. When we're constantly moving, constantly doing, constantly consuming information without processing it, we never give ourselves the opportunity to actually learn. We accumulate experiences without extracting meaning from them. We repeat patterns because we never pause long enough to see that they're patterns. The hard way becomes inevitable when we never create space for the easy way to reveal itself. What if we approached life as an ongoing conversation rather than a series of battles to be won? What if we saw challenges as questions being asked of us rather than obstacles to overcome? What if we understood that everything difficult is trying to teach us something, and our job is to learn as quickly and gently as possible? This shift in perspective doesn't eliminate difficulty, but changes our relationship to it. We become students rather than victims, learners rather than sufferers. The pain may still come, but it arrives with less bitterness, less resentment, less sense of unfairness because we understand it as part of the curriculum rather than as punishment or bad luck. Ibn Arabi lived 8 centuries ago, yet his words echo with urgent relevance today. Perhaps every generation needs this reminder, this wake-up call to learn differently, to pay attention, to extract wisdom before disaster extracts it from us. Perhaps this is one of the fundamental human challenges across all times and cultures. How do we become wise without being broken? How do we grow without being shattered? How do we learn what we need to know through gentleness rather than violence? The answers exist, have always existed, are available right now for anyone willing to look, to listen, to learn, but they require something most of us find difficult to give: the surrender of our certainty, the release of our need to be right, the humble acknowledgement that we don't know everything, and that's okay. That's actually more than okay. That's the beginning of real wisdom. How might your life change if you began treating every discomfort as a whisper worth listening to rather than a noise to ignore?